I know. So, second call for taking your seats. It would be great if people could sit near the front as well, if they... a little bit of time so that we of our conference on the future of the EU. I just wanted to say a very big thank you to the three sponsors of the conference once again, not least because Charles got one of their acronyms wrong and called them the IMF, which it would be great if we were being sponsored by the IMF, but it's in fact IBM, and the other two. The title of this session, I rather regret I wrote without a question mark, because I feel like I've opened myself up, particularly to the person on my right, to a bit of a stats class. EU in an age of mass migration, question mark. I mean, if we think about how many irregular migrants, for example, have crossed the Med since the non-Schengen members, then we're looking at about 450 million. You know, the UK, we've had a fair amount of discussion about free movement, migration and Brexit. The UK, there are now around 3 million citizens from of the EEA countries in the UK, but that's only 5% of the population. Define mass migration. But plus of people in Italy and Germany rates migration as a very important issue facing the country, and support for free movement, not just migration from outside the EU, but free movement in Italy. It's still positive, and most people support it, but it's now down at levels which are not that much higher than those seen in the UK. And as a result of that political tension, then we've seen the UK government favouring border control in the Brexit negotiations, and we've seen the EU favouring border control when it comes to irregular migration. So to unpack all of these issues, we've got a fantastic panel for you. We've got Sophie Magennis, who's head of policy at UNHCR. Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College in London. Monika Dhian, who's General Director of the Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands. And Raoul Ueberecken, Director for Home Affairs at the European Council. We're going to go in alphabetical order. Speakers have between 5 to 7 minutes. I'll be reasonably strict on time. So, Sophie, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sophie Magennis. That's the European institutions here. I'm very grateful to John at the outset and in his introduction in setting the scene in terms of the issue of migration and refugees in Europe, and rightly pointing out that although we often hear the contrary in the media, there is a very small proportion of the world's forcibly displaced, actually in industrialized countries, let alone the European Union. For instance, 86% of the displaced developing world, they are not. And I think that when we're and we're talking about how the EU responds to the issue of refugees and asylums and also migration, we need to keep that global context in mind. Perhaps the second thing that we need to keep in mind as an introductory comment when we talk about the future of the EU and the issue of refugee protection, migration, is to remember the past of Europe and indeed the emergence of the idea of international protection. It was in this region that the idea of international protection was fully born and enshrined in the 1951 Geneva Convention. So Europe has a really deep-seated investment in the idea of international protection. In terms of introductory comments, one further key point to make is that recently in New York, September last year, global leaders gathered a summit on migration and refugee issues, and they adopted the New York Declaration. This declaration sets out the agreement of world leaders to work together to find solutions to issues facing refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. And at the heart of that agreement in New York is the understanding that the only way to arrive to finding solutions, including engaging with the private sector, engaging with civil society more, and beyond. So I think when we're talking about the in the EU, we need to keep this international context in mind. I want to make just 5 brief points, which are UNHCR's proposals as to how refugee protection issues could be better managed by the EU. And those 5 start with number 1, addressing root causes, really reinvigorating the efforts of the European Union and the global community in addressing the reasons why people flee from their homes in the first place. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has really committed himself to trying to re-energize the international community in solving conflict. And if we look at the near neighborhood of the EU, this is clearly very important today. We need to see greater stability in Lebanon and many other countries that are on the doorstep of the EU. And in particular, we need to see improvements in the conflict resolution efforts in Libya and also in Syria. Secondly, we need to see more of an investment in what are known as resettlement solutions or safe pathways. UNHCR and many member states also engage in that program where refugees are resettled and where they cannot find a solution where they are. Resettlement into the EU has been into the EU as refugees, and recently the European Commission has announced that it's calling on EU member states to resettle 50,000 refugees into the EU. We think this is a very significant, important effort, and we would like to see member states back these initiatives more. Some of you may have seen that last weekend, UNHCR with partners managed to evacuate 25 refugees from Libya to Niger, from where they will be resettled on. This was a first step in trying to bring protection to people in Libya when they cannot access it there, and we would like to develop this initiative, including also with member states. Thirdly, we need better continuity. The question as to whether the EU and its happened in 2015 and 2016 in Europe in terms of the operational response to refugees and asylum seekers arriving in large numbers in Greece. I think that if we look closely at the current plans, we feel that the lessons have not fully been learned. We don't yet have a comprehensive contingency planning set of arrangements to make sure we have the right intelligence and apparatus in place should people be seeking protection in the EU in larger numbers in the future. We also crucially need solidarity amongst
the voluminous economic literature which shows that free movement that labour mobility in the EU is broadly beneficial in terms of what it does to economies and labour markets, I think it also actually worked as a means of adjustment. But, and there is a but here, there are some potentially quite big long-term issues, not for countries like the UK and Germany, which frankly I think have done just fine from an economic perspective out of free movement, but for some, not all, but some of the bigger source countries. And these relate to demographic trends. And frankly, you know, if you were if you were responsible for economic policy in a country like Latvia, for example, you would be quite right. You would be and are quite rightly worried that free movement has aggravated an already very serious demographic crisis. Now, I do not think, to cut to the chase, that ending free movement is in any sense a remotely feasible or sensible solution, either legally, economically, or politically, to demographic trends in either Southern Europe or the Baltics. But it sharpens the policy dilemma for those countries that will need to do something to sort out the demographic crisis that they face. And I think that brings me on to the second half of the set of issues, which is around migration, and particularly economic migration. I'll defer to Sophie on refugee issues, migration from outside the EU. I would start by saying that the broad point, first of all, is that enthusiastic as I am, and indeed as most economists are about migration in principle, I do not think that it fundamentally represents a solution to demographic issues. The scale of the migration required to really change demographic balances is too large, and ultimately, the fact is that if you want a sustainable population, you need to have your fertility rate at roughly replacement level, not too large or not too high, and migration can help smooth some of the adjustment to that, but it cannot solve the problem in the long term. Ultimately, you have to get the policies right domestically to ensure that, families and households want to have roughly the right amount of children, which in the developing countries particularly of North and Northwest and East Africa, that are the largest source countries for the UK, means giving women access to the tools to control their own fertility, and girls access to education and all these things, so that they can reduce their fertility rates, and we know that will happen if we do so. Equally, in the countries of the European Union with hugely suboptimal fertility rates, that's in particular the Baltics and some of the countries of Southern Europe, it means, again, empowering women in rather different ways so that they can balance work, childcare, and family in ways which allows them to have children and allows young couples to set up homes outside of the family home, which is a big problem in some countries in Southern Europe, and so on, and ensures that there is some degree of financial support, particularly for low-income working families with children. Again, we know from the experiences of countries like France and the UK that these policy solutions do actually work. So to my mind, those are the sort of things that we need to address the demographics on both sides of the issue. That does not mean, of course, that as I said in my introduction, that migration pressures will not build. They almost certainly will, and I think we know very well from the work of economists like Michael Clements on this, that one thing, that while development aid in general and promoting development in source countries is a good thing and will help those countries, it will not reduce migration pressures. The evidence suggests that, if anything, the likely short-term impact by reducing transaction costs and increasing access to information will, if anything, make it more attractive and easier for people to migrate. That is just something we are going to have to live with. It's something we're going to have to deal with. On the whole, if managed well, regulated migration will be a substantial economic boost to the European Union. What is clear is that the problems that we have seen in respect to the refugee crisis over the last couple of years, and with respect to people coming from Syria, also apply in spades to people coming primarily for economic reasons from countries of, from African countries, in particular West and North Africa. The EU will, over time, have to work out a way of regulating and managing these flows. At the moment, we are a very long way indeed from doing that, and I think I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Monika, over to you. Do you want to use that microphone? Oh, yeah, if that works.
Thanks, John. In our panel Division of Labour, John asked me to discuss 3 aspects of the EU's long-term migration strategy. That is the linking up of aid with migration policies in migration partnerships, the politics of migration partnerships, that is to say, can we ever expect, imagine politically, something else than tighter border controls? Could the EU, for instance, consider legal pathways for migration? And third, the competences. Do member states need to pass more power on non-EU migration to the EU level to make policies more effective? So first, the linking up of aid and migration policies. When we look at the recent coalition agreement of the new Dutch government, we can conclude that migration has become the lens through which foreign and development policies are viewed. Aid and migration policies have become tied to each other more than ever. EU migration partnerships with countries of origin and transit, such as Niger, Mali, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Senegal, are key elements of that perspective. In the context of these migration partnerships, the EU is meant to deliver development aid, strike trade agreements, and conduct capacity building activities in the border and security sector. And according to the EU, these compacts have a number of advantages. People no longer have to make this dangerous, expensive and irregular journey. You disrupt the business model of smugglers. They help to develop the reception capacity to host migrants in countries nearby the country of origin, and they address the root causes of migration, like Sophie indicated. I would like to suggest 5 points for discussion here. The first are human rights concerns, because the strategy of migration partnerships involves cooperation with states that often have poor human rights records. Against that background, EU member states should ensure that agreements contain provisions with respect to the protection of refugee and migrant rights, and should provide the support required for partner countries to improve along these dimensions. And I think EU and bilateral policies can then have a positive effect on the human rights situation of migrants. The second concern involves the carrot and stick practices with aid money. Concerns have been raised that these practices send a clear message to countries with substantial refugee and migration populations that they can use migration flows as a negotiation chip to leverage benefits from the EU or member states. However, that control over migration flows as a new source of power is, of course, nothing new. Several years ago, I was in Spain and heard about the story of the yacht of King Mohammed of Morocco that dropped its anchor at a spot that Spain considered Spanish territory. The Spanish Coast Guard then entered the ship, asked everybody on board for his identity papers, including the king. Several days later, a couple of thousand migrants managed to enter the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. So it was clear again who is key in controlling the Spanish southern border. Well, against that background, the diplomatic assignment is to identify win-win strategies in which common objectives are identified. And then, for instance, the tone in the recent coalition agreement of the Netherlands, which starts by warning partner countries that if they do not cooperate in migration policies, that will have consequences for aid flows, might not be the right one. Also not if one considers that remittances from migrants to their country of origin are way larger than these aid flows. A third concern of the effects of migration partnerships have been their consequences on livelihoods in countries of transit. My colleagues from Clingendael just published a study a line in the sand on the consequences of these partnerships on the Agadez region of Niger. The implementation of strong repressive measures resulted in a substantial decrease in migration flows passing through Agadez. And given that the migration economy had become an important economic driver for the region, the question is whether enough economic alternatives have been created to cushion the fall. Well, my Clingendael colleagues found that rapid implementation of programs sponsoring alternative economic opportunities is still lacking. These programs have not yet offset the adverse economic effects that migration policies have had on that region, so that is a source of concern. A fourth concern involves the legitimacy of local authorities that cooperate with the EU. Our research shows that the Agadez community has become increasingly frustrated with local political authorities who are seen to work to the advantage of the EU rather than their own population. Recognizing the need to take action, local authorities recently backed a plan for small economic projects for Agadez inhabitants who used to work in the migration industry, the so-called reconversion plan, and a quick-win reconversion plan. And a last concern has been that potential grievances sprouting from economic backlash create severe conflict risks. Our study finds that Agadez is relatively stable for now, but that the region is experiencing an increase in insecurity at various levels. So against that background, there's a need for conflict-sensitive approaches to migration management in this region. Well, John's second question was, is any other policy than tighter border control politically viable, imaginable? Could the EU, for instance, offer legal pathways to the EU? Let me much more briefly mention 5 reasons why legal pathways would make sense. First, because legal pathways for refugee protection would, like Sophie underlined, would be a clear signal that the EU is still committed to responsibility sharing in the refugee domain. Second, legal pathways would undercut human smuggling. It would be easier to check who is entering Europe. Integration of migrants would be easier because people would not move to the kind of fringes of the society. And offering legal pathways could make it easier to negotiate effective readmission agreements. Member States would then grant visas for migrants in exchange for a commitment to swiftly taking back all citizens of the same country who have arrived illegally on EU territory. Well, are legal pathways politically possible? Not in the Netherlands for now. The first round of coalition negotiations failed because the Green Left wanted to resettle 5,000 refugees per year to the Netherlands, 5,000. Conservative liberals thought this is political suicide. So this was the end of that round of negotiation on the coalition agreement. But maybe it is politically possible in the EU. See the summit in Paris of Macron, Merkel, and the African countries. Directions to that summit made clear that trading legal pathways for shutting down illegal ones might not be direct political suicide. And the political narrative might then become a slightly more solidarist and effective fortress Europe. That is to say, a fortress with stone bridges for regulated entry. One bridge for refugee protection, one gate for economic migrants, one gate for circular migration, etc. But the last question, very briefly, was how we could improve the institutional environment for such migration partnerships. And I think most suitable will be the formation of coalitions of the willing, enable member states on the basis of the enhanced cooperation provisions in the treaty or just multilateral agreements. I think in such a sensitive area as non-EU migration, that might be the most fruitful and fastest way forward, better suitable than moving competences from the member states to the EU level. That will be another bridge in the current political context, I think, maybe one bridge too far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monika. Raoul, over to you.
Thank you, John. My name is Raoul Ueberecken. I'm Director for Home Affairs at the General Secretariat of the Council of the European Union. Before joining the Council Secretariat, I was working for the Luxembourg administration. I was heading the Justice and Home Affairs team here in Brussels at the representation during the 2015 presidency, which were quite challenging times. Roughly 2.5 years after the height of the crisis, I think indeed the time is right to look back and to try drawing some lessons. I'll try to make 5 points. The first one is, I think, a rather obvious one, but still one that I think needs to be made over and over again. It's to acknowledge that migration and response to migration is complex. It's a complex puzzle, many work strands, both internal and external, and there are no quick fixes. There's also no one-size-fits-all. That simply does not exist. The second point, I think, is that from that we need to recognize that we need to have a rather comprehensive, probably rather complex toolkit to draw from. The toolkit must be readily available, sufficiently and properly staffed and financed. My third point is that we also need to recognize, to admit to ourselves, especially in the Brussels bubble, that the EU cannot and should not give the impression that it is able to solve or to respond to this alone. Certainly member states themselves alone is difficult as well. This is something that needs to go hand in hand, but we also need a lot of flexibility. I think the experience over the last years has shown that not everything has to be done at 28 member states. There have been front runners in some parts of the crisis, and they have sought and gotten a lot of support at EU level and from the other member states. My fourth point is, in terms of the support that the EU can provide and has provided, I think a lot has worked. Not everything perfectly, far from. There have been many challenges. We have learned as we went along. But there have been, I think, quite a number of very positive elements. The first one, I have a number of them, randomly I have to say, and probably certainly not comprehensive. The first one is situational awareness or situational picture. I think we know now much better at EU level about migratory flows than we still knew 2 years ago. At the beginning of the crisis, we were scrambling to find numbers that were actually accurate and that we could rely on to draw policy consequences. The second element is deployment of staff from around the European Union, around the member states, through EU agencies. Within the crisis, we reformed the mandate of the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. We're in the process of enhancing the mandate of the EU Asylum Agency. Third element is the mobilization of financial resources. If you look at the number of different funding instruments we have drawn from to finance different parts of an EU policy, I think rather impressive. The fourth element I think we agree often that there have been positive experiences, there have been a lot of challenges and drawbacks as well, is the hotspot concept, which I think in itself has proven to be quite useful. Fifthly is the cooperation, obviously, with third countries, that I don't need to expand on. It's I think, self-evident. One other element I think I need to say here, especially with Sophie on the table, is working with UNHCR and IOM and other international organizations and partners, because we have so much to learn from, and we realized that there were people out there that had so much more experience than we had in dealing with a crisis. I do think that we can discuss that maybe later because some might disagree, is the reintroduction of internal border controls. My point is that that was done within an agreed, an existing framework. And the last one was relocation. As I said before, we, I think, had to learn a lot as we went along. The most challenging element is and remains the implementation on the ground. I think that's really where we need to focus on. What we now need to look at, I think, is to consolidate, to see how we can be better prepared, more resilient. And for me personally, there are 4 elements that stick out here. The first one would be having at EU level, together with member states, a crisis management system mechanism in place that is ready to be deployed when a crisis strikes, both at strategic and operational level. There's really some contingency planning that needs to be done. The second element is to have a toolkit ready for partnerships with third countries. We've seen some good experiences over the last years, but I think it's been clear the way the EU has responded to the challenges over the last years, that the partnerships with third countries and mostly our most immediate neighbors has been crucial. The fourth element, and has been touched upon already by others, is legal pathways. It's not an easy one. Monika just outlined that. Nevertheless, there's been some progress in the Council on that. I'll just take as one element of proof of that the Council agreed last week on a negotiating mandate for the resettlement framework proposed by the Commission. My fourth and last element is a rather short one, but one, again, that's pretty much obvious. That's the money. We're coming into difficult discussions on the next financial framework. I think in that it has to be recognized that migration needs to deserve the place it should have. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Raoul, and thank you to all of our panelists for an interesting and varied set of opening remarks. We can open the floor up to questions. We've got about 50 minutes or so for a discussion. And I'm going to just ask a couple of questions myself, just to kick things off. The first one is to Sophie, and you talked about external processing and very kindly name-checked my and Luigi Scazzieri's paper on this. The question, I suppose, is your discussion about safe pathways and resettlement of asylum seekers into the EU. How does that differ from, say, France going and setting up or working with the government of Niger to set up a processing centre whereby they too would be bringing asylum seekers into the EU? To Jonathan, the big question, I suppose, is just about the demographic crisis in the Baltic and the South. I mean, one of the things that many people have been saying about the free movement system is that it is, to a large extent, circular. So, you know, you have a lot of young people going and working for a few years elsewhere in the European Union before returning home. And I just wondered if, you know, that meant that the kind of demographic problems that you're talking about may not be as problematic as you might think, particularly because of convergence of incomes within the EU. To Monika, I suppose the big question is about whether migration partnerships, whether you're being a bit unduly negative in the sense that people have been pretty clear that they're talking about more for more. and not less for less. So the idea being that extra aid in exchange for closer, tighter border control is always extra. It's not actually taking away. And then to Raoul, I mean, I suppose you talk about there needing to be a kind of comprehensive toolkit, and also that the EU, so far at least, we've had a fairly chaotic response to migration so far. But what kind of institutions are you talking about that we might need? Do we need to have a common asylum policy, as Monika suggests? Is that likely? Do you need to have a border guard which is has a much stronger mandate to be able to secure the Schengen borders and so forth? Should we go in that order? Sorry for the long questions, but I had a lot of them.
Well, thank you very much for the easy question, John. I think the first thing to say is that in a lot of discourse at the moment, we see the notion of resettling refugees into the EU as being presented as an alternative to people coming to the EU to seek asylum. And we think this is a bit of a false construct for a number of reasons. First of all, resettlement itself is a protection tool. It's described a lot by some member states and others as a migration management tool, but resettlement essentially is a protection tool for people, refugees, who are in need of protection and who are in a third country where they can't integrate and they need to move to another country where they can restart their lives. Resettlement has to be seen as simply that. It's a protection tool to try and provide protection to some of the world's most vulnerable. The reason that we don't see it as an alternative to the notion of being able to still claim protection in the EU, there's a number of reasons for that. But let's look at what the proposal is at the moment that EU member states are looking at. The idea is that in the future, when a person comes to seek asylum in the EU, all EU member states would be obliged to check whether in the first instance they could be returned to what's called a safe third country. And in that safe third country, the national authorities of that country would do the asylum investigation and look at whether someone's in need of protection or not. It's a little bit like the EU-Turkey deal. The EU-Turkey deal sets out that when an asylum seeker comes from Turkey to Greece, they should be sent back to Turkey because Turkey can look at their asylum claim. This idea would lead to EU member states saying to any other countries outside of the EU that have an asylum system, we want you to do this work, we want you to carry the burden of that. We think that this strategy is rather counterproductive, because what we're trying to do as UNHCR, in close cooperation with the EU agencies and EU member states, is we're trying to build protection capacity in many countries around the world. This is what we do as our daily work in conjunction with NGOs and other organizations. It's going to be increasingly difficult for us to encourage member states to develop functioning asylum systems, for example, in North African countries, in other African countries or Asian countries, if those countries know that the end game would be that now that they've set up protection spaces, wealthier countries can transfer asylum seekers back to them. So what we're trying to encourage member states to do in the EU is to really commit to the New York Declaration, which is about responsibility sharing globally, and that the EU and its member states would play its part. That means having a protection space within the EU that functions for the very small proportion of the world's displaced that comes here, and actively helping countries outside of the EU to develop protection spaces so that they can provide protection to the refugees who are there, not so that they can perhaps send additional refugees to those countries. We think that this kind of strategy would help the EU in the long term. If we look, for example, at what's happening with the Rohini crisis, EU member states and institutions are welcoming and calling on Bangladesh to keep its protection space open, even when more than 600,000 Rohingya have arrived there in recent weeks and months. So we can see that globally this is how we want member states to react, and we would hope that EU member states would continue to do so. The real trick, I think, politically, is many citizens don't trust that governments can manage migration properly. There's a lot of support in EU member states for protection for vulnerable people. You hear people saying, well, we would favour refugees getting protection, but we're not in favour of everyone staying. This is about making sure that there's a proper approach to mixed migration, where people who are in need of protection are identified quickly by governments and granted protection, and those who are not in need of protection and who have no other humanitarian reasons to stay should be offered assisted voluntary return, and if they don't take that up, should be returned to their countries of origin where there are no protection issues arising. And when governments can prove that they can do that, then I think citizens would support a better managed migration and refugee policy in Europe.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Your question was, I think, whether we should worry less about the demographic pressures on countries in Southern Europe and the Baltics because the people who've moved will return home. And I think the short answer to that is no. Yes, some people will return home. Lots of people, of course, when they migrate, do so in principle with the intention of returning. But I think one thing that history shows very clearly is that that's not how migration works. Temporary migration very frequently becomes permanent migration, whether that was the case for people from Turkey coming to Germany, people from the Caribbean coming to the UK, and so on. Looking, for example, at the experience of people who came from 2004 onwards to the UK, very, very large numbers of them have now put down roots, either in terms of their progression in the labour market or because they have, because of family formation, children and so on. I see no reason to believe that won't be the case not for everybody by any means, but for very large numbers of those who've come from Latvia, from Spain and Greece in recent years. So I think this remains a problem. But as I said in my opening remarks, the answer to that remains, as always, in changing domestic policies in order to both to integrate immigrants from outside, but most immediately to encourage fertility.
Thank you. Monika.
Yeah, your question whether I was not too negative, saying it is the idea behind team partnerships is more for more, so you cooperate, so you get more aid. But in the Dutch context, I think the conservative liberals have tried to make clear that it is less for less. So cooperation in the migration domain is made, there's conditionality really added to development aid, and I think that is not going to be a very productive tone. What you do see, for instance, in our studies, is that there is a priority for the measures that consider capacity building, border control, and there you do see, I think, a shift from policies that contributed more in a broader sense to development in those countries to measures to stop migration. We see securitarization there, even militarization here and there. So that aspect, I think, is also true for the EU. But you're right that this is my specific Dutch context with the less for less.
Yeah, but may well generalise to other countries. Raoul.
Thanks, John. On the institutional question, actually what we've realised, I think ourselves, a bit to our surprise, that we have a lot. That a lot has been used and activated during the crisis. For example, one of the tools we've used for the first time is the so-called IPCR mechanism, it's Integrated Policy Crisis Response mechanisms, which brings together the Council, its Presidency, the Commission, all the relevant agencies, external partners, the relevant member states. And through tools like that, we actually managed to have the situational picture that I referred to earlier, something that didn't exist before that. It also allowed us to have a more coordinated response. But there have been quite a number of other tools that were used as well. Under the EU-Turkey deal, there is the appointment of an EU coordinator, Martin Vevey, with his team in Athens. I think that that's an experience we should look into and draw the lessons from it, what has worked and what hasn't. The Commission, for example, has EU regional task forces in Sicily and in Athens again, bringing together all EU actors at a more local level. And of course we have the agencies, Frontex and the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, with Frontex having joint operations going on as we speak at all the most exposed external borders. Nevertheless, I think there is a clear recognition among colleagues in member states that we need to have this organized. The Estonian presidency organized a closed seminar a few weeks back for so-called SKIFA committee people. Those are mostly the directors of the member states' migration directorates or structures. And there was a very that we need to have a better structured, more integrated system with clearer divisions of responsibilities, but also that is properly staffed. We're in Brussels, in the institutions, we're very good at drawing up new legislation, getting it through the legislative process and so on. We are no crisis managers. You need people that know how to do that, and frankly, we don't. Maybe we know a bit more now than we did 2 years ago, but I think there's a real recognition that we need to have competencies and capabilities there that we don't have. The same, for example, goes for financial resources. You need to be able to deploy the financial resources quickly. I think whenever we needed to find the money, we more or less managed to find the money. It hasn't always been easy, but the problem is more quick disbursements, having quick procedures, etc., that can handle that are crisis fit, and that's I think those are elements we need to look at really from what we've been through the last years.
Thank you. Okay, let's open up to questions. I have Francois Esberg first. Let's take them in rounds of 2 or 3.
Thank you very much. The question I'd like to put to the panel members is the following. If you take a 10-year, 15-year time frame, which is not a very long period of time, how do you see the scale of the problem that you've just been discussing? How do you see it evolving? Jonathan made the point earlier on that we cannot expect, as conditions improve, that we will have a reduction of out-migration from south to north, and I think that is borne out by the empirical evidence. And we do have the prospect of states undergoing failure, I think in particular of the risks in Algeria. I have seen estimates here and there of 20, 30 million people coming from sub-Saharan Africa as an extrapolation of greater out-migration on the one hand and less effective tools to hold them back Moroccan style, or in a more confused way, Libyan style, Tunisian style. So how big is it, say, to 2015, 2016?
Thank you. Hélène.
In October, the Hungarian government has made a national consultation to about 8 million eligible voters in Hungary. Plenty of false statements about the migration policy of the European Union, among other false statements. So my question is simple. Has the European Union reacted? Should the European Union react? How should the European Union react?
And Monika.
So I wanted to pick up on a point that I think Jonathan made about the role of migration in structural adjustment to shocks, to economic shocks within the EU. And we've spoken a lot about, or we've thought a lot in the UK about how the UK has benefited from migration, but also about how the UK has played a major role in helping Southern and Eastern European countries adjust to shocks. What is that adjustment process going to look like after the UK leaves and the UK is no longer a favoured or possible destination?
Okay, thanks very much. So we've got 3 questions there. You can answer, you know, one or all of them if you like. Jonathan, should we start with you?
Okay. I mean, in response to Francois' question, I mean, the simple answer is what is the scale? We don't know, but the sort of numbers that you talk about, 20 to 30 million, are certainly perfectly feasible. You know, you are much more of an expert on the politics of Northern Africa than I am. Historical connection with France, given the proximity, you would expect that to be Syria squared. And equally, you can imagine, it is perhaps not the central scenario, but you can imagine similar things happening for Nigeria. It's farther away, but the numbers are even greater. So the potential is very large, and the consequences are very serious. The EU would be faced with a choice between turning itself into a fortress with all the human and moral human, moral, and broader political consequences that would mean, or dealing with very, very, very large inflows. And I don't think, as I said in my introduction, I don't think we're anything remotely near ready for that. And I think near ready for that or capable of dealing with that. I don't know what the answer is either. I'm no better qualified than Raoul is to make crisis plans, but I certainly think that this should be in the top 2 or 3 things that the EU is worried about. Monique's point about structural adjustment, I think that's correct. I mean, but it goes more broadly. Clearly, Brexit means a reduction in the size, both the size but also the diversity of the European economy as a whole, to the extent that the UK becomes less economically integrated with the UK, both in terms of labour markets and other aspects, and that will be detrimental to both the economy of EU member states and to the UK. There's really no getting around that, as your research has shown. And I think one interesting econometric analysis you do of the impact of single markets is that actually it's quite difficult to disaggregate to the extent that type of analysis actually reflect the benefits of labour mobility. We simply don't know that because the data and the analysis doesn't permit us to distinguish that. I'll skip Helene's question for the moment on Hungary.
Raoul, do you want to have a bash at Francois' question?
In the sense that I think that we don't know what the scale is, but I think the point I've been trying to make is that we should, I feel, urgently look into what we've been through, draw the lessons, and try to be much better prepared for anything next, and also realize that that there is no quick solutions. Be clear about that. no quick fixes, and that every situation needs to be dealt with differently. There's a huge number, I think, of policy response elements that one can have. It's for politicians to choose which ones they want to use. But in what I think we've seen, looking at Turkey, Libya, Morocco, Senegal, Mauritania, sort of direct neighbors, is that each time the response was slightly different. We've drawn from different policy elements, but I think we need to have that toolkit ready to be used, be knowing what it means to use this or that, and everything has positives and negatives in that. There are drawbacks from all of the policy solutions. I think we need to have that ready.
Monika, do you want to answer any of those questions?
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge and accept that increased development will lead to more migration. That might not be what we've seen in the last 10 years is not according to theory. When it comes to Western Africa, for instance, it has been lower than expectations on the basis of theory. But we do see an increase correlating with development, and we need to accept that. It will be a lot of intra-African migration, obviously, but there will be increased pressure, and we really need a management of the border with legal pathways to deal with that, recognizing that we do need labor, considering our fertility rates, etc. So we really need to normalize migration in the decades to come. This is not to say that we do not need to address root causes more ambitiously. I think, like Sophie indicated, where it comes to conflict as a source of people taking for refugees, and where it comes to the fertility rate, girls going to school, because this is obviously really not sustainable. So there we really need to cooperate to avoid disaster, I think. Yeah. Where it comes to Hungary, what we do need to acknowledge that there has become a political atmosphere vis-à-vis refugees. I spoke to refugees in Budapest. They said we might acquire refugee status. There were Syrians. I think the success rate is 11% for Syrians in Budapest, whereas in the Netherlands it's 100% almost. And they said, if we manage to acquire asylum, we will come to Rotterdam, really. We'd rather be illegal in the Netherlands than a legal a status holder in Hungary. So that's also one side to what is happening now.
Sophie.
Thank you, and thank you for those questions. In relation to the question from François on the 10-year time frame, very difficult to say, but we know what the trends are. So 10 years ago, we had just over 30 million displaced. Today, it's 66 million globally. So another trend that's important is that the number of refugees who are able to return to their countries because conflict has been resolved has massively declined as well. So we're seeing what the UN Secretary General speaks about a lot, which is the failure to deal with existing conflicts, frozen conflicts threatening to reignite, and new conflicts arising. So I think that the best that we can say on this is a continued failure of the international community and institutions to deal with conflict will likely lead to the current trend continuing. And that is why we are hoping that globally member states will take the New York Declaration seriously. Under the New York Declaration, up with a global compact for refugees within 2 years. IOM has been charged with leading on a global compact on migration. And the idea there is to come up with real solutions rooted in all countries sharing responsibility through which we can try and globally come forward with some solutions at the global level. Many EU member states and EU institutions are playing a key role in the discussions on the global compacts. There's discussions happening in Geneva, in New York, with a view to fleshing out what these solutions might be. And I would reiterate the point that whatever the EU member states decide to do as their model for how to interact with asylum seekers and refugees is likely to be replicated in other regions. That brings me to the second question from Hélène on Hungary. In addition to the questionnaire, I think something that's of great concern to us is the fact that in Hungary you have a mandatory detention policy at 2 border points on the border between Hungary and Serbia. There are what are called 2 transit zones, where a very small number of people are allowed into the transit zones every day, and there's a mandatory detention policy. That includes children over the age of 16. We don't want to see this type of approach where we have mandatory detention of asylum seekers, very climate that's unwelcoming to refugees, that sends a message that they are unable to integrate or uninterested in integrating. These things are very detrimental for the EU also. And I think what is missing a little is leadership on these issues. Many of the things that people say about refugees and asylum seekers when it comes to the number of them that are here, their behavior, connections to security issues are false. And I think that politicians are finding it very difficult to stand up to emerging right-wing parties. We would like to see greater leadership, clarity, and people sticking to the facts when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. Thanks.
Thank you. Ray Taylor.
Ray Taylor, PwC. My question is a slightly broader question about migration issues. If you look at the back over an extended period of history, there has always been economic and refugee migration all through the history of man and womankind. It just appears that at this moment in time, it's become a lot more politically sensitive migration that would appear to be driving a lot of political reaction to addressing what's perceived to be the problem. If you accept that assumption, I would be interested in your views as to what you think governments need to do to try to move the issue away from it being a political issue to more of an economic issue outside of some of the things that you've said already.
Thank you. Simon, did you want to ask a question, or did I put you down on my list wrong? No, okay. Oh, gentleman just about there.
Garvin Walsh, and for the purpose of this question from Philippe Legrand's think tank, Open, I'm struck by a sort of absence of a historical dimension to the discussion we're having, because large migration flows aren't new. Even in Europe, they've been much higher in the past. In 1956, there were about 500,000 people who fled Hungary in a year to Western Europe, which was then much poorer. There were obviously the World War II related refugee flows that were massive. There were the Vietnamese boat people. And my question is then, what's different this time? Why do we not seem to be able to react in ways that are as constructive as ways that we were able to react in 20 or 30 years ago when we were much poorer than we are?
Tom Nuttall.
Just to ask a slightly provocative question. I mean, if we look at some of the major challenges that are facing the EU and several of its member states at the moment, things like the East-West divide on relocation and reforming Dublin, which is still completely stuck, difficulties in forming governments in the Netherlands and, of course, in Germany, the growth of populists, and particularly in Western Europe, you could even argue Brexit. A lot of these can be traced back, at least in part, to what happened in 2015 and the response to it. What lessons should we draw from that, and how should we respond if we were faced with such a crisis in future, if we want to avoid such political difficulties in the future?
Thank you. Monika, why don't you go first?
About the absence of the historical dimension, what is different this time, I think it is a sense of the future. It's a bit related to what Ms. Seisburg asked. It's the shadow of the demographic developments in Africa. It's the shadow of knowing the conflicts which are looming very near to Europe. It's the shadow of the consequences of climate change and what that will do to people very close to us. So it's not, I think, an absence of the historical dimension, it's an awareness of the future dimension that makes this all quite serious. We ain't seen nothing yet, I would say. It's also problems with integration, I think, that add to the political dimension of this all. In the Netherlands, for instance, we see more and more that integration affected by the level of education or the integration in social and economic networks in the Netherlands. It's more and more influenced by what happens in the countries of I think problems of integration of certain groups are also interfering with the political discussion. I do think that when the labor market will change, economic sense will enter the discussion, again, this political discussion, because we will see shortages in the labor market soon from now in one country earlier than another. Germany will be ahead of many. The Netherlands is a bit as falling after that. So this will make a difference, I think. Where it comes, what should we learn from 2015? I think what we should learn is how to regulate, how to manage our borders, how to cooperate with countries of origin and transit to deal with migration. Because I think the worst that can happen to migration is irregular migration, and what that does to the people in terms of not being in control. It's not, I think, the slogan of the populist has been taking back control, and it's control over borders that people have lost the sense of. So regulating borders, controlling them, which does not mean closing them. It means gates still, but regulated and properly managed.
Raoul.
Well, on the last point just made by Monika, I was just looking again at the conclusions of the European Council, the last ones from October, whereas I'm trying to do the comparison with 2015. I think where, at least during the first month, the response has been rather shaky, to say the least, to such a phenomenon, to such flows. And if you look at the wording that is now used by the European Council, it says ensure full control of the external border. It uses words such as the flows are significantly reduced, wording about stemming the flows, etc., etc., comes back and back again. So in terms of, I don't know if all of that qualifies as an EU migration policy or the beginnings of it, but there has been over a number of meetings of the European Council very, very, very strong language as to how the EU's response is. At first. Then, of course, quite a number of other elements on it, and I think the cooperation with third countries, but also legal pathways and resettlement are part of that. Mm-hmm. There are obvious challenges in that. On the question of the economic migration, for example, which often is part of the sort of dealing the EU or member states have with third countries, be it countries of origin, countries of transit, is that that is not in a single hand at EU level. Legal migration, economic migration is still very much a prerogative of the member states. We have only small bits and pieces of legislation at EU level. It's mostly sectorial. There's no overarching framework for that. The conditions, yes, they are more or less harmonized, but numbers are certainly not. That's really a prerogative of the member state. So in that sense, there's still a lot of elements one can look at to the future, I think.
Jonathan.
Both Ray and Garvin sort of talked about the historical context and implied that somehow things are much worse or that we are different this time than in previous episodes. I think I would question that. I mean, migration has always been a political issue just as much as an economic issue in Europe. I was looking recently at the election leaflet for the Conservative candidate in Bow, Bethnal Green from 1895, where he said that who was responsible for high rents and low wages and sweated labour in East London? The answer, Eastern European immigrants. And that backlash against Eastern European immigration in 1895 led directly to the Alien Immigration Act of 1905. Similarly, very much within my own lifetime, and in fact something of considerable, part of my own family, in the early 1970s, when a group of people with British passports from East Africa of Indian origin wanted to come to the UK, there was a huge public outcry, and it was extremely politically unpopular. And it was only the political leadership of the then Conservative Prime Minister, Ted Heath, who quite bravely took the decision to honour the UK's obligations to these people that led to them being admitted. That's not their presence in the UK is no longer controversial, of course. Neither of those groups, the Eastern Europeans and Jews of the late 19th century or the East African Asians of the 1970s, but very much was at the time. So I'm not sure that much has changed. What should we do about it, and why is it difficult to react? It's because these are very complicated political issues that go to the heart of how people feel about national identity, culture, and I agree with very much with what Monika said on those topics. Political leadership is required. That has sometimes been present over the last few years, but as to a large extent it has been in Germany, despite the many problems. It's also been very much absent in other contexts and in other parts of the EU, and it sometimes, as Hélène said, has been very deliberately counterproductive, indeed verging on fascist, as in Hungary, and there is a duty on other political leaders and on the EU to stand up against that. What can we do positively? I mean, I do think one key test actually on this will be what happens in Germany and also in Sweden over the next couple of years. If Germany can follow up its courageous decision taken by in 2015 to allow refugees to come and settle, if it can follow that up by demonstrably making a success of that decision, by showing that those who have arrived can be successfully integrated into German society and the German labour market, and that their children will be Germans of Syrian origin who make a contribution to Germany, and similarly in Sweden, then that will provide a very powerful example to the rest of Europe. If that, on the other hand, is perceived to be a failure, then the consequences will be very serious. So there is a big further responsibility on Germany and Sweden to make a success of that, and of course we very much hope they will.
Monika, just briefly, you wanted to come in with a point.
Yeah, just to get back to your opening statement, but don't you think that it is historically unprecedented, the combination of fertility rate, lack of economic perspective in the region, the conflicts in the region, the effects of climate change on don't you think that this is historically unprecedented? You don't have that, these trends are not striking to you?
Well, I mean, everything is, I mean, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So I don't think that I mean, yes, you know, climate change is different from anything the world's seen before, and there are more people than the world's ever seen before. But the sort of is this, so of course situation is different, but in terms of scale or proportion, I don't think certainly nothing we've seen yet, you know, equates to the sorts of, to what, if you look back at the historical experience of Ireland, for example, at the time of the famine and thereafter, and the changes in population trends in Ireland, we haven't seen anything quite like that yet, for example. Maybe we will, but not yet.
Sophie.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the person who raised the question about the historical perspective, which I think is key when we're sitting in Europe. One interesting illustration, I think, of why the historical perspective is so important is what happened in Hungary on the 4th of November 1956 when the Soviet tanks rolled in. That weekend, 10,000 people fled from Hungary to Austria. By the end of the month, by the end of that November, 200,000 Hungarians had left Hungary, 180,000 of them to Austria, 20,000 to Yugoslavia. The Austrian Interior Minister at the time engaged with the international community, engaged with the General Assembly, and basically what he said was, our estimate is that Austria can deal with 20,000 of these people. We need solidarity from the international community. In the end, 180,000 Hungarians were resettled from Austria and Yugoslavia. 100,000 of them were resettled within 10 weeks. They went to 37 countries globally, including 2 in Africa and 7 in Asia. Here in Europe, in 2015, the European institutions rallied very well and managed to get a decision passed on relocation. That had a commitment from member states to relocate 160,000 asylum seekers over a 2-year period. I agree with Raoul that this was a very important development, and it did lead to the relocation of nearly 35,000 asylum seekers within the EU. But the work that had to go into achieving the relocation of 35,000 people was disproportionate when we look at what was achievable in Hungary for Hungarians in 1956. What we are lacking now is trust, solidarity, and member states willing to work together. If it could have been done in 1956 in Hungary, it could be done today.
Okay, let's have a last round of questions. If you want to ask one, catch my eye. Ian Bond.
Thank you very much. Ian Bond from the CER. I wanted to go back to the root causes question. I mean, I've been saying for a long time we should do much better on the root causes. But as I sat here, I became increasingly pessimistic. And I don't know whether this is a question primarily for Sophie and Monika, maybe. But what exactly is it that the EU can do that makes the root causes get any better? Because we've tried spending a lot of money in places like Afghanistan, and it hasn't really worked. And we've tried doing next to nothing in Libya, and that hasn't really worked. And we've tried spending a lot of money on refugees outside Syria, and that hasn't, I mean, it's worked to some extent, but there's still a lot of them. Is there something that we are missing? Is there something that we should be doing that tackles these root causes in the various conflicts? Or do we actually just have to accustom ourselves to the fact that we will need in future to resettle hundreds of thousands or millions of people every time there is another conflict?
Luigi.
Luigi Scazzeri from the CR. So my question is about readmission agreements, which presumably would be an important part of the EU response to the challenge of migration in the future. And in the past, to strike readmission agreements, the EU successfully used the prospect of accession as leverage. This won't be on offer in any of the cases that the EU will be negotiating in the future. So we've mentioned legal routes, although that will be a long-term prospect. We've mentioned extra aid. Again, this will probably have to be of a very large magnitude to actually act as a lever. Perhaps commercial policy would have been another of the elements to mention. But my question really is, to what extent do all these things presume a common European policy, and to what extent can they actually be done with coalitions of willing member states? Thanks.
George Robertson.
Sir, I'm George Robertson. I'm not from the CER. I was in Moscow last week, and in a company I was with, I was postulating that the rule of law was actually much more important in terms of the values that we protect than the ballot box. And the point was made to me by one of the Russians there that when you talk about Sharia law, we tend to think about sort of the Judeo-Christian form of law, but Sharia law is another form of rule of law that some people take for granted. You know, maybe I've missed something in this great discussion, but is not the problem of assimilation to do with the fact that we're trying to assimilate people from a different religious background, and that is one of the blockages that prevents the huge numbers that we saw in 2015 from actually being absorbed. You know, you talk about 160,000 Hungarians being absorbed into Austria. Well, there was an Austro-Hungarian Empire. The assimilation is going to be a lot easier than Muslim Syrians into a European culture that finds it difficult to absorb that. And what do we do about that?
Okay, thanks very much. We've got sort of 5 minutes left. So if you could answer those questions in 1 minute, that would be great. Sophie, you're first.
Oh la la, 1 minute. Where to start? Very quickly, on what else can the EU do? A little bit beyond my brief in UNHCR, but I think globally we need to see more engagement in solving current crises. Where are we at with the Syrian peace process? Where are we at with the Libyan process in terms of dialogue on that? There is perhaps more that the EU can do in partnership with others to try and achieve some progress when it comes to these, or at least even for EU member states amongst the 28 to agree on a common approach to resolving the political crisis in Syria and Libya. On money, we had warned as UNHCR in 2011, 2012, that if the appropriate funding was not going to go to the refugee camps in Jordan and refugees living outside of camp settings in Lebanon, that these populations would move. We had refugee populations living there for many years, children not accessing school, and we made the point that these people had aspirations for their children. If they didn't find solutions where they were, they would likely move. So we need to do much better to assist people where they are. On the question from George about the challenges in integration, there has been a good bit of research recently on what can work when it comes to integration, and the EU and its member states have developed a toolbox to try and help integration. We think that there are ways for people from very different cultural backgrounds and communities to come together. Some, of course, are more challenging than others, but where cultures find themselves in a very, very new community, we like to see a process that takes a two-way approach. So the refugees who arrive need to make their own changes in order that they can fit in well in the society, and receiving societies also has to come a little bit to meet the new cultures and people who are there. On the rule of law issue that you raise, which is a fascinating one and one that deserves a lot more discussion, I guess we would always insist that rule of law sits within the framework of international human rights law. So it's an established principle that legal systems, for example, need to fit within human rights law, and we would insist on that for refugees who have rights and obligations as well when they come to the EU.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Sophie just said, but I think I'd be a bit stronger and say that George's premise is basically a historical bullshit. I mean, look, the Jews, the Eastern European immigrants that I was talking to who came to the UK in the late 19th century were Jews, right? They came from a different culture, from a very different religious background. We managed. The East African Asians I referred to, who came to the UK in the 1970s, were mostly Hindus, but to some extent Muslims, and from an entirely different cultural and religious background. Again, we managed. Looking at Muslims in Europe, of course there are issues, of course there will be issues, and there is also obviously a security issue, as indeed there was with Jewish anarchist terrorists in the UK in the late 19th century, frankly. We can, if we do some of the more nuanced and sensible things that Sophie has suggested, the European Union and European Union member states with goodwill and sense are perfectly capable of coping with this. And and in terms of the adaptation to human rights and legal standards in the EU, for example, we saw recently that when the UK Parliament voted on equal marriage, of the 8 members of Parliament from a Muslim background, only 1 voted against. That was a rather more and quicker accommodation to, quote, liberal, unquote, standards than was demonstrated by the overtly Christian members of the UK Parliament. And I would note that exactly the same thing happened in Germany, where, again, members of Parliament of Muslim origin were more likely to vote for equal marriage than those of overtly some other Christian backgrounds. So I think the premise is simply wrong. I'll stop there.
Monika?
Well, I do think that we have to move beyond a certain degree of economism, that when it comes to integration, that we think that the moment that people are economically integrated, then social and cultural integration will follow, because that is not what we have seen in the Netherlands. If you look at survey research, you do see that groups of, for instance, Turkish and Moroccan people that are economically integrated, although the economic integration is less good than other groups. There is a regression where it comes to social and cultural integration. That is not to say that it's their fault, but culture is an issue when it comes to integration. And I think when it comes to integration policies, we should not only try to integrate and invite people to integrate in our economic model, but also in our social model. That is to say, the democratic state, our rule of law, our secular society, the principles of the secular society, etc. And this should also be the focus of integration programs. Ian asked about the root causes policies. Just to mention 3, I think stability is crucial, contributing to stability. There was a survey recently among people that entered Italy through the Libyan route, and 34% of them didn't even want to come to Europe, but they were kind of caught up in these flows because of the dangerous situation in Libya. Second, in Niger, the reports that we've just published show that how important it is to contribute to the infrastructure there, so railroad construction, infrastructure projects, and also contributing to a kind of entrepreneurial attitude, skills and competences, so that not everybody goes for the easy money, being through smuggling or opening shops, but certain diversification in the economy. Last but not least, access to family planning. The idea that 220 million women who want access to anti-conception do not have that, there is really a way to contribute.
Thank you. Raoul.
Thanks. On the question of the EU or collective response or more coalition of the willing, I think it's a combination of both, to be honest. If you look at the migration partnership frameworks that were launched in 2016, sort of an EU response to dealing with the main countries of origin or transit. If you look at how these are implemented in practice, it's very much about the European Union or the EAS more specifically taking the lead, but bringing together those member states that have a real interest. When there are missions going into these countries now dealing with issues like readmission and so forth, the ones that are joining are obviously not the 28. Because the 28 have no interest in dealing with those countries, but it is those that have an interest in dealing that are going. Another example of this, I think, is sort of the ways we interacted with the most important countries of transit or the countries of departure, where there was a lot of not EU but collective piggybacking that was done. Engaging with Turkey. The EU-Turkey deal was mainly a feat of Germany, the Netherlands, with a bit of the Commission in there. What's dealing with Libya is, I think, shouldered at the moment quasi exclusively on the EU side by Italy. Morocco, or many years back, Western Africa, Senegal, and so on, Spain. But I think the important element is that at some point you have to bring this back to the table of the 28, because what the 28 can bring is the necessary political cover of this, the necessary support, financing to some degree. Look at the EU-Turkey deal. Again, member states are affected by the migratory flows on the eastern route very, very differently. So there was a keen interest by a few to go and do this deal with Turkey, but it was brought back to the table of the 28, with the 28 endorsing it, supporting it, etc., etc. So I do think it's a combination of the two that is important here.
Well, thank you. I think that was a fantastic discussion, and thank you to everybody for your questions and comments. And a special thank you to our excellent panel.
Thank you.